So you've made some art, and now the problem is, well, what do you do with it? Well, art exhibitions are a major way that art gets out into the world. And one of the major problems that kids get early on is, well, what are exhibitions? How do you find them, and how do you even apply? Okay, so real quickly before we start, you probably noticed that this video is quite long. And to make it a little bit easier on us, all the places I'm going to mention, like places to look for exhibitions like Cafe or Call for Art Online, they'll be in the description below, along with a link to a portion on my my personal website where I build what I call research and development, where things like exhibitions, residencies, other kind of opportunities like I'll talk about here, you can find more links there. Okay, so straight off the bat, what is an exhibition? Well, basically an exhibition is anything that shows your work. It can be something that's like a museum or a gallery or a pop-up show, an art collective, a university, an online format, a print magazine, or even a public library. These are just a couple of the ways that they're shown, but really, for the sake of this discussion, an exhibition is just any place that shows your work. When we start to look at where we find them later, then we'll start to be able to talk about what the differences are between each of those venues. So now that we have a vague idea as to what an exhibition even is, then we get to the question of, well, why do they even matter? Well, to kind of put it the most simply, shows matter because you are making visual art. And the whole thing about visual art is just that, it's visual. Think of it like a musician. If you were a musician and you never recorded a song or played for other people live and you've never made an album, you're not really a musician, you're just a guy who plays piano. So the most important thing that they do is they get your work out into the world, they get people to see it, they get people to kind of consume it in whatever method it is, in person or out of person. Another thing that it does is it helps build your CV. I'm not going to go too crazy into what a CV is, but essentially a CV is a list of your merit-based achievements. These include things like awards, exhibitions, residencies, that kind of stuff. And when you're applying for exhibitions, part of what they're going to look at to sort of estimate your merit for getting a show is your CV, including how many shows you got. I know it's a little bit like, chicken and the egg. You need shows kind of to get shows, but that's honestly a little bit how it is. Another major thing that it does is they give you the potential for awards. And what I mean by awards are not just like, here's a ribbon because you made a nice painting. Awards from exhibitions can be things like purchase awards from the institution or museum that has it. They can give you residency opportunities. Residencies are basically long-term, typically funded endeavors where they will give you space and money and resources to make work. You can also get things like just straight out sort of like monetary gifts. If you reach a certain kind of prize award, you can actually get literal money from an exhibition after being a part of it. Now, the bigger one when it comes to understanding exhibitions is, where do you find them? That's probably the most common question, because usually by now people know what an exhibition is. They kind of know why they're important, but they don't really know where to get them. So I'm going to kind of run through a lot of places in a couple of different formats that we can find them. Know that there are more places than this, but here's what I'm going to kind of talk about for the purpose of this. First, there's a place called Call for Entry. Call for Entry is like a kind of aggregator, or they're like a website that all they do is they try to host as many different exhibition opportunities and residency opportunities, or really any kind of professional opportunity on that page. Another place that we can look for is College Art Association. College Art Association is actually a group for college level art educators that do studio art or art history. But they also have a lot of great opportunities online that are open to the public that you can get access to whether or not you're actually a part of CAA. Other places are in places like Glass Tire. Now, Glass Tire is a kind of Texas-specific place. I live and work in Texas, so Glass Tire is the place that I look. There are a lot of other sort of statewide arts places that host opportunities like that. It's not as reliable, but Instagram is also an okay place to look. Call for Entry has a really big range of the quality that they have. Instagram has an even more incredibly wide range. A lot of the stuff you're going to find on Instagram is not terribly great, but know that there are some good opportunities to find between some of the other nonsense that's on there. Another place you can look is what I call institutional mailing lists, which are basically if you know of a gallery or a museum or any other place that would that has exhibitions going on, usually they'll have a mailing list that you can sign up for, and in being a part of that mailing list, you can be informed of future opportunities. And that's a really good place, especially in the beginning, to start, is find a place that you want to exhibit at or that you want to show your work at, and keep an eye on them. You can track them through a mailing list or just by checking in periodically to their kind of online formats. Last but not least, and honestly almost kind of the most important, is about your artist network. And what I mean by this is you make things, you need to get in touch with other people who make things. A big way that you can kind of keep your energy and keep in touch and be aware of what's happening is to be a part of a kind of community, whether that's in person or online. It helps for you to know about resources. I know personally I've had opportunities that I've been a part of that other instructors or other artists that I've known or people I've gone to grad school with have made me aware of. And it's always good to help give back to your little artist network also. So know if you have a gang of people, they can help you and you can help them. So in understanding the different exhibition formats, one thing to keep in mind is quite basically how many people are a part of it. If it's an exhibition and you're the only person who's a part of the show and only your work is exhibited, that's usually called a solo show. In applications that are looking for solo shows, they'll usually use that term to kind of denote that aspect. Other than solo shows, there is what's called a 2 or 3 person show. Obviously, that's 2 or 3 people. The next step is what's called a group show. And a group show is typically more than 4 people, and it's usually a whole variety of people that have been decided on by a kind of juror. I'll talk about what a juror is in a minute, but basically know that there are solo shows, 2 and 3 persons, and then groups. Obviously, having a solo show is a little bit more important and a little bit more prestigious. A 2 or 3 person is the next step, and a group is not a bad thing, but it's not as grand a CV line as, say, a solo. Now, regardless of how many people are a part of it, one thing to keep in mind is whether or not the exhibition will be physical or digital. There are a lot of opportunities that are in person where you literally just get the stuff and you put it on the wall or you put it on the floor or whatever you're doing. But there are a lot of really good opportunities that are purely digital. One that I know of that I've always appreciated and is actually quite prestigious, completely online, is called New American Painting. Obviously, it's kind of focused for painting, but they're one place that does it all entirely online. You don't ever have to mail anything. You don't have to ship anything. But know that there are opportunities that are both digital and in person. Now, there are a whole laundry list of other things to keep in mind when looking at exhibitions, but we'll just kind of run through what some of those attributes are before we get to how to tell how important a show is. The first thing to focus on is how long is the work exhibited. Obviously, if work is being displayed, whether it's digital or physical, how long that work up matters, and know that it'll usually be no shorter than a few days, like a weekend, and it's usually no longer than a few months. Within those kind of bookends for the window of time, they will usually state somewhere in the application how long it is. Another major thing to look at when understanding how exhibitions work is whether or not they have an application fee. So all these exhibitions, they're made by different places and different institutions, but they will usually always have a fee, even if the fee is $0 and it's effectively free. They will always state it in there. In the descriptive information that goes with the exhibition. Now, I know there's a good amount of sort of free exhibitions that are no cost of entry. Sometimes those ones that are no cost of entry require that you be in a certain kind of a group. One of the more common exhibitions that are free is if you're an art student at a college, most of the shows that you can apply for as an art student will be free. Other than the free ones, usually the price or the cost for applying, because this is effectively a cost to even just apply, independent of the cost of shipping and all that. The cost of apply are usually, the lowest I've ever seen is like $5. The highest I've ever seen it is $60, which is pretty dang high. 30 or 25 is probably the average. The high end, the $60 one is for New American Painting, which is, again, I mentioned earlier, it's a great opportunity and it's a great resource. It's prestigious. But the downside is with some of those options like that, they do have a slightly higher cost for the actual application. Part of the reason why they have a cost in the application is there's literally, if they're going to open this to everyone in the world or everyone in whatever region that they're doing it for, there are people who are going to have to sit behind a desk somewhere or behind a computer, and they're going to have to look at sometimes hundreds of applications. That takes time. So the application exhibition fee goes to help cover part of that. But know that application fee is something to look for. Another thing to keep in mind is, does the exhibition have a reception? And a reception is basically a kind of point in the exhibition period, typically at the beginning, called an opening reception, or an ending called a closing reception, where the gallery or museum or whatever institution that is exhibiting the work typically makes it open to the public with the artist present. So a reception is this kind of, it's not really like a meet and greet, that's kind of a way to put it, but it's a way that the exhibition can kind of draw a greater crowd, and they'll usually have the artist there to kind of give an artist talk, or just to be there as a kind of incentive to have more people come out. This might sound really basic, but another thing to keep in mind is, how is the work installed and how is the work deinstalled? Install is basically when the art goes into the space, whether it's sculpture or ceramics or whatever else, it actually has to get in there. The same is true for getting the work out of there. For installs and deinstalls, typically it's usually the responsibility of the artist. Now, usually the institution will have at least a few people on hand to assist, but ordinarily, no, it's the job of you, the artist, because it's your work and your application, and your you're basically asking to be there. And part of how that process happens is that you sort of coordinate the work getting in and out. Now, when it comes to making it easier on you and the gallery or museum or wherever, usually they'll have a floor plan. A floor plan is kind of typically a drawing or a kind of map of the space that will say how long the walls are, how tall the walls are, if there are outlets where those, but basically it will kind of detail out what the space looks like so that you can plan how much work needs to go into the space to make it easier for when you get the work in there. Usually you'll get a floor plan if you're accepted, but know that a floor plan is a part of sort of the general material to keep in mind in putting together an exhibition. Another important thing to keep in mind is whether or not they have special installation instructions or restrictions. A really common way that this happens, although this as a category is not very common, a big way that we interact with this problem is, say it's a really old building, like several hundred years old, and it's now a museum or an exhibition space, and they don't want people to drill into the walls. Obviously, that's going to make installation a little bit different. Typically, they have a kind of like metal hanging infrastructure, but know that there are some restrictions when it comes to installing the work. Just like install and deinstall, these are typically things that are covered after you've been accepted, but there are also basic restrictions like how big is the door. That may sound dumb to say, but if you make giant sculptures, keep in mind what are the physical restrictions of the space. If it's really restrictive in a way that's not very common, they will usually make those restrictions evident in the application by saying, no work longer than X amount inches or something like that. Regardless of whether you install or somebody else installs, obviously the work has to get there. This is just sort of what we call shipping. Whether or not you drive it there or put it in a box, usually it's just referred to as shipping. Another thing to keep in mind is, how is shipping covered? Almost always, the artist has to pay for shipping because, again, you're the one who's applying for the show. You're the one who's coming to the institution or museum or whatever saying, I would like an exhibition. So because of that, it's typically paid for out of the artist's pocket. But know that some, especially more prestigious or harder to get exhibitions, will sometimes have a kind of stipend to help cover for those costs. But keep in mind, how the work gets there is a part of the kind of whole exhibition application process. Although it's not common, one thing that is also a component is sometimes you'll have what's called a studio visit, especially for really big exhibitions that don't happen very often. Like down here, we have the Texas Biennial, which is literally an exhibition of artists in Texas that happens only once every 2 years. With things like that, sometimes they'll have a studio visit where if you apply for the exhibition and then you make it onto the short list of candidates, those shortlisted candidates will be contacted. The juror will come out and actually meet you in your studio, and then depending on how all those studio visits go from that shortlist, then they'll choose who gets into the show. Another component to keep in mind is the application limited by entry? Now, usually this is for institutions that are a kind of demographic focus. Like let's say it's an institution that tries to give exposure and opportunities to a certain member group or other demographic group. Like an example down here we have is the Young Latino Artists exhibition that they would do sometimes at the Mexicarte Museum in Austin. Obviously, for that kind of exhibition, they're wanting to make that an opportunity specifically for, Hispanic and Latino students. So know that in the kind of thematic overview for the show, sometimes they'll have restrictions. It's not very common, but obviously it's not the best look if you're applying for a show that by definition you aren't even qualified for. The most important thing to keep in mind, honestly, is kind of who the juror is. And that will help us get to the next portion I'm going to go over, which is basically how to tell if a show matters. There is an endless river of shows you can apply for. This is America. If you pay for it, they'll take your money. Know that getting at exhibitions is important. It'll help build a CV. It'll help get you to kind of more prestigious places. But know that there are a lot of places that have exhibitions that, honestly, they won't really make that big a difference after you've gotten enough shows. And the juror is part of what makes that show most important. Basically, a juror is the person who decides who gets in the show and who doesn't. Usually, they're not a part of the institution that's showing the work. They're not a part of the museum or gallery or whatever. And they're not one of the artists. Usually, they're somebody that the institution brings in and they hire for the entire purpose of deciding who gets into the show. That is always advertised in the application process. And that's probably the biggest thing that makes the determination of how important a show is. Obviously, if the juror is someone that says, curates for the contemporary section of a major museum, that's going to be a much bigger deal than maybe, someone who just is someone that works at the gallery and they don't really have any connections to anywhere. So know that keeping in mind who the juror is matters a good bit. Now, once you start to actually apply for exhibitions, part of how you're going to help build your CV is by going along what I call the exhibition ladder. And basically what that is it's a way to kind of rank the importance of shows independent of the juror, but across where the outreach is. So obviously, the wider the outreach and the further it is from you, the more you're building your CV and the more you're building your connections and the more you're proving your capability than, say, just having someone around town show your work. The exhibition ladder basically goes like this. It starts local. Obviously, local shows are things like in your city. They're in places around you. They're usually the place that you start. And because of that, it's not like favoritism, but it's much easier to get shows around you. It's much more difficult to get shows further away from you. So start with local shows. After you get local shows, then you can focus on statewide, especially if you're in a big, ginormous state like Texas. Being where I'm at, I can get shows in the other cities, which are almost as far away as other states, but statewide shows are the next step. That will help you kind of branch out and build your CV. After you've got statewide shows, then you're going to kind of move up to the next step in the ladder, which is called regional. Regional is basically just any states within one or two of yours. Obviously, if you're in the Northeast, those are states in that area, but it's sort of the next step after you've done local and state to kind of expand to your region. After you've done regional, then you get to the national grade, which is basically you live in one part of the country and you're getting shows in complete other parts. This helps to kind of demonstrate that you have, a network and you have a kind of dedication and that you have a pure merit-based quality to get shows independent of people who just live near you. And at the very end of the exhibition ladder are the international shows. And this is sort of what I kind of rank the highest level of achievement. So starting with, local and going to state and then regional and national and international. International is sort of the highest achieving level of exhibitions where you are able to get shows in parts of the world that don't even speak the same language. So it really helps to maximize your outreach. It helps to get all of your work out there at a kind of capital level. It gets you international lines, which will always help stand out on your CV. When you start to look at CVs for people who get exhibitions, you're going to see, if they live in Virginia, almost every single line is going to be Virginia. If they get a show in, let's say, Venezuela, or they get a show in Germany or in Mexico, that's going to stand out a lot, and it's going to kind of prove that person's capacity and determination and quality of the work they make. Now, let's say that you've determined that exhibitions are something you want to do, and you found some online, and you've decided to actually apply for them. Then it gets to actually building the application. Now, the application will almost always dictate all of the measures needed to apply, but all of the applications will include a few important things. These are things like high quality images. This is a CV, a bio, a proposal, an artist statement. Obviously, images, you kind of want those to be high quality. They will usually tell you how large they can be by a sort of maximum dimension of pixels. They will usually tell you what minimum quality, as something like 300 dpi, which is really common. DPI, again, obviously is it doesn't literally mean pixels per inch, but DPI is how dense the pixels are within the image. CV is obviously the list of your sort of merit-based achievements. These include things like your education, awards, exhibitions, any kind of relevant experience. If you're a teacher, your teaching experience would go there. If you work in a nonprofit, basically all of your merit-based achievements that prove your capability as an artist are what go on the CV. A bio is kind of self-explanatory, but it's a short writing that's basically about you. Typically, they want these bios to be kind of short, between 250 to 500 words. And usually they just cover a little bit of background information, where you went to school for your education, for your BFA or whatever else. And usually a short listing of the more important CV lines. A proposal, was sometimes called a letter of intent, is basically a work of writing that tells the gallery or museum why they should give you that space, and if they give you that space, what you intend to do with it. They understand that a lot of the times, because these applications for some of these exhibitions will be sometimes a year or two out, that you don't have that work currently made. And because of that, usually they're okay when they're a year or two out with it being new work that doesn't exist yet. So usually a letter of intent or a proposal will be, describe the work that you intend to show for that time. And that's part of how they accept or deny that application, is through that proposal or intent. Another part that's always a part of the application is what's called an artist statement, or sometimes called a statement of research. This is different than your proposal or letter of intent, where the proposal and the letter of intent are basically what you intend to do with the space. It's going to be 46 paintings, or it's going to be a bunch of sound or whatever. An artist statement or statement of research is, why do you make what you do? If you're currently an art student, especially if you're one of my art students, this is what we refer to as a thesis. And yes, start all the booing, but this is where your thesis matters. This is basically, why do you make stuff, and why should this institution give you the time and space and sometimes money to actually exhibit this work? I know it's a really big, lotty, open-ended thing, but really when art gets beyond just painting a fish like a fish, it's the statement of research or the artist statement that is not the most important part. The work is obviously the most important part, but it's a very important part to making the work viable or not for the institutional resources. Now, I cannot stress this enough. The most important part of every application is good work. I feel like people forget that. They'll spend all this time building their letter of intent or getting a good bio photo, but then they will just have sort of all the effort go to the application process, and they'll make sort of B- effort work. The most important thing in any application for an exhibition, or really any kind of award in the arts, is your work. Make the best work you can, make it as often as you can, and take good photos of it. I really cannot stress that enough, but good work is the most important part of the application process. Once you kind of look at all the application items that they are looking for, they will usually list any restrictions like I mentioned earlier. Sometimes they want them all compressed into one PDF, and sometimes they want them under a certain maximum file size. Like, let's say you have to include a CV and a bio and all this other stuff, and it all has to be under like 5 megabytes or something. They will usually tell you the method of getting it to them also. Almost always it's going to be by email. All these exhibition opportunities usually go through what's called a coordinator or some other kind of title that's like that. But they all typically go through one person who sits on a committee of people that decide, and it's almost always by email. But no, any of the restrictions on size or number of items will be listed in there. One of the things they sometimes ask for is called an image slide list or an image list. This is basically when you choose the images that you're going to show, they typically want you to number those off and then have a sheet of paper that lists, like number 1 through whatever, title, year, materials, that kind of stuff. All of the relevant information for how the thing was made so that when they see the image online, they can tell what they're actually looking at. This is where if you make really big work or really small work, it's going to kind of look the same on a computer screen, and that'll help contextualize it for them to know if you only apply for, let's say you apply for a show and you only have 4 paintings. Well, if each of those is, 9 by 6 feet, obviously that's going to help them decide whether you can fill 4,000 square feet. So know that they will usually want some size and titles and materials on an image list that goes with the application. Okay, so let's say you've found an exhibition and you're like, yep, let's do it, that's the thing, and you've got the materials together and you're all ready. Then it comes to the next important step, which is what I call first contact. It's actually sending it to them. Now, usually this is the bigger problem because people will get kind of nervous or whatever, especially when they're young art students, and they'll maybe not feel so confident about their work, or they won't feel confident about their writing. And usually this is the part where if somebody falls off the boat, this is around then. So try not to worry about it. If you wait until you're ready to do it, you will probably never do it. How you start is kind of just by starting. The worst thing they can ever say to you when you do an application is no. And I mean, who cares? I've had quite a few shows, and I've had some shows that I'm proud of. But if you were to put the stack of yeses I've got next to the stack of nos, it's tremendously higher on the nos. That's just part of how it is. You won't get into every exhibition you apply for, and that's okay. The most important part of first contact is make the deadline. I can't believe I have to say this. I sit on a committee for a gallery. I've done so for 4 years now, and you would be surprised how many people don't make the deadline. The deadline is usually always a part of the application. If it's not, ask. I can guarantee you it's almost definitely in there. But make the deadline. If you can make the deadline before, if it ends on the end of the month, maybe send it a week early. It's not the best look if you're the last person who got it in at like 11:59 of the last day. It doesn't mean that that's really going to tank you as long as you make the deadline. But no, making the deadline is a really important part. When you get to actually sending the email, try to get a professional email. I don't mean it has to be super stuffy, but it helps for the email to, have your name. If you have a very common name, just try to find something like first name dot last name, basic string of numbers, or first name dot last name art, or something like that. It doesn't really help, and it's not the best look to send an email for an application when it's from, like Booty Rock 420 or something. For one, don't do that. Just don't do that. But it helps for us or whoever's getting the application to kind of know who it is in just the email and not be offended by that email. When it comes to writing the body of that email, try to give it a good outro, dear so-and-so. If you don't know who it's going to, the easiest place or the easiest name you can write it to is dear name of place committee. Let's say you're going to be bold and you're just going to send something to the MoMA for some reason, whatever. Dear MoMA committee or whatever, or dear gallery committee. That's the easiest way to kind of write to. Usually these decisions about exhibitions are made by people who don't sit on those committee boards permanently. Usually they're rotating. So just write it to dear blank committee. In the same way you're going to intro it, try to outro it. Just say thanks or sincerely or something. I usually will thank them for their time because they have to look at hundreds of these things. They have to look at so many exhibition applications, and it takes a lot of time, to be honest. As someone who applies for shows and is a part of some committees that decide shows, it never hurts to just thank them for their time. Obviously, you kind of want to just generally be nice. It sounds dumb, but try to, spell things correctly. Try to use proper grammar. You get the idea. But try to intro it. Try to outro it. Try to give it a professional email. It sounds really dumb to say, but almost all of these exhibition applications will happen by email. And because they happen by email, try to check your email often. whether you get accepted or denied, it'll almost always be by email. If you apply and you don't get the show, usually you won't hear back. They don't really take a lot of the time to say no to every single person. Usually they will do it by email and just inform you through the email if you're accepted. And if you don't hear anything back, it's usually safe to assume that you didn't get accepted. Now, I've talked a lot about the way that emails are for applications. There are a few other ways that applications are done that are not through email. They're not usually for exhibitions. They're more for things like jobs or residencies. But there are some places that are like Submittable. Submittable is an online system that you will sometimes find exhibitions. You will still find the exhibitions in the same place, like CAA or Cafe or whatever, but no, the actual application process, if it's not by email, it'll usually be in a system kind of like Submittable. Sometimes they'll use like a Google form, but no, it'll usually be by email, and sometimes it will be in a couple of other places. Now, let's say that you get into a show and you're like, all right, great, now what do I do? Well, now you actually have to ship the work, and shipping the work comes down to kind of two things to take in mind. Are you going to drive the work, or are you going to mail the work? If you make really big stuff and it's very heavy and there's a lot of it, you're probably going to want to drive it, because shipping things that are very heavy or very large gets really expensive. If you make things that are kind of like paper-based or fabric-based, mailing is almost always an option. A good way that I kind of measure it is based on if I can drive there in about 4 hours, I will usually drive it. And if I can't get there in about 4 hours, I ship it. This is because if I have to drive it out there, I obviously have to drive back. I don't live there. And if I have to drive any more than 8 hours, it's going to be more than a day. And it kind of gets to be such a burden that if it's that far away and it's not that important, I just wouldn't apply in the first place. So just know if it's, you're going to kind of find the metric that works for you, but usually driving or shipping it are the two options. And just make sure you don't kind of spend all of your money shipping artwork if you can get it there, driving it, or by some other way that's cheaper. That's pretty much it. I know that's a lot of stuff, but it's basically that whole process. You find an exhibition, you decide that it's important, you apply, and if you get accepted, you send the work, and if you don't get accepted, just keep applying. And that's pretty much it. You kind of just run through that cycle as many times as you can until you can get your CV built up. And as you build your CV, kind of move up the exhibition ladder. And as you move up the exhibition ladder, it'll help you get more shows. It's kind of like that self-fulfilling loop. Having shows will help galleries feel more comfortable to give you more shows. And the more shows you get, the more awards you're likely to win. And the more awards you're likely to win, the more art you're going to make. So no, exhibitions are kind of the legwork that get you moving up and out into the process for building the CV and getting jobs or getting shows or sort of improving the quality and sort of value of your work. I know that has a lot of information in this, but as a kind of rundown for exhibitions in general, that's a pretty good overview of what they kind of are, how do you find them through services like Cafe or CAA, and the basic application process. I know it's really at a distance. If you guys want to know more about a specific process or a specific component, or even just doing one whole application beginning to end, let me know and I'll do that. Other than that, go team.